like some water?
After my intro, I'll invite you
not yet.
to the lecture. And then we have the panel, and then I will invite
You're going
you.
first. Or
No,
second, yeah.
After the first panel and the Q&A, I will invite you, James, to do the presentation. You do it from the lectern. Good?
Perfect.
Yeah. Hi, hello. How are you? Yeah, we met before. Hi, Carl. All good?
All fine.
Yeah. I'm waiting for the ring, and we're going to head off. And
I think I read somewhere, I got one note which said...
Ruspe, that's yours. I don't really need this. Is this mic on? No, I don't think I need it. Do I need? I only need this one. This one, do I need it? Okay. Yes, I think it worked. So good morning, everyone, and very warm welcome to the 12th edition of CEPS Ideas Lab, hosted and organized by the Center for European Policy Studies, CEPS. And we begin today by this very first plenary to take this talk and look at the past year. Because I think the past year has been very eventful. We've seen decisive elections across the globe, looming challenges, geopolitical tensions, and hope and the need for lasting peace in Europe and beyond. So it's a good exercise, to stop, to pause, and see where we stand today. And to do this, we're going to present and unpack the findings of two surveys today, exclusively for CEPS Ideas Lab. It will be presented for the first time. One on the business sentiment, to hear what CEOs think, what they worry about in the EU, and another one on the voters' preferences across Europe. My name is Tinatin Akhladiani. I'm research fellow here at CEPS, and it's my pleasure to guide this stock-taking session for the next hour. And I'm joined with excellent speakers, so please join me in welcoming all of them. We have with us Ruspe Hashemian, partner PwC Germany. We have James Kanagasorio, Chief Research Officer, Focal Data. Otis Lobboom, Director of Strategy and Economic Analysis, DG GROW, European Commission. And Daniel Gross, Director of Institute for European Policymaking, Bocconi University. Also our former research director, and the one who has actually launched Ideas Lab back in 2014. Thanks, Daniel, for being with us, and to all of you, welcome. We have a lot to discuss, and I will make sure to turn to you in the audience for a couple of times as we go through the discussion, so, stay ready to jump in. And without further ado, let's move on and dive into the first survey. Ruspe with us. So just to quickly point out that this is the survey that PwC has been running across the globe, right, Ruspe? And the global findings have been presented recently at Davos, right? And this is the first time that we will hear the results about the European Union. So very curious. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tina. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. And as you pointed out, we've been doing this for the last 28 years. And in the last 28 years, what we've been doing is change the questions every now and then. But it's really interesting to also see how the world has developed in the boardroom over the course of the 28 years. We have quite a bunch of colleagues here from PwC also in the room. So when you feel like this is not enough data, they all had the briefing on more data. So if you're interested in that, please stop by. Also, I'm here for the entire day. Let's take a quick look on which of the CEOs we asked. So 4,700 across the globe, of which round about a fourth is within the European Union. So you could expect large as well as smaller companies be represented, but this is what we think a really good representative view of what the boardroom conversation is doing right now and what's going on in those conversations. The first question that I want to take a look at is we asked CEOs about how viable they think their business model is in 10 years' time. So what the feedback is, they're telling us that in the European Union, 47%, almost every second one, is afraid that their business models will not be viable within the next 10 years. Compare that to the United States, where the number is probably half the size, and I do think quite comparable to what we see in Asia Pacific. So if you take a look at it from a policymaker standpoint, I think you're pushing in an open door on the need for change in businesses. So I do think that is good news for us to look at. The main question remains, are they actually changing their businesses fast enough? And I'll get back to that question at a later point in time. The second one then, obviously, technology is a key driver of that change. We've all been talking about generative AI, agentic AI, and so forth. When we asked business leaders about their expectations last year, around about 40% came back and said, we do believe that this is going to be an extreme driver of productivity growth across our businesses. Even though this year we asked them, how much of that did you actually realize? And that number was not very high. But even though that number was considerably low, expectations have been rising. So this is due to the fact that most of them have now, so I think around about 83% is what they told us is they have installed or implemented AI systems within their organization. You know that they had, I think 100% of the organizations do have that installed right now. But they started to learn from it. They started to understand the challenges of implementing AI within their organizations. And this is not just a regulatory challenge. This is, how do I get my people to understand what it does? How do I change my processes, my data, and everything associated with that? So we do believe that the number that we are seeing up there will continue to increase, regardless of what the last 12 months have impacted in regard to the real P&L effects of the implementation of AI. What we do also believe, and I'm a little scared about this, is that usually we over-expect the effect of technology in the short term, but we underestimate the effect in the longer term. And I'm really afraid that as a European Union, we would fall into that trap again. So let's stay focused on it and continue to drive the change as we see CEOs are open for that themselves. So technology is one big driver. Obviously, climate is the second one, and I think this is good news. 89%, and we're leading in the world, if you look at the data that we've collected from CEOs, have initiated climate-friendly investments in the last 5 years. So we're leading on the investment side. That changes considerably when we look at the benefit side of it. So while, let's start in the United States. So while in the United States, it is as likely for CEOs to report back on the cost that has occurred with those investments, they also have the same level of revenue growth associated with those investments. If you look at Asia Pacific, actually the revenue increase would be reported much more likely, even compared to the cost effect. That picture is considerably different around the European Union. So the 1,100 CEOs we asked came back and said that the cost effect is currently higher than a positive. So they're increasing the cost, they're not increasing the revenue. So the question that I would come back for us today is, are the economic incentives really aligned to drive action around this agenda? It seems that it's more regulatory-driven rather than business-driven agenda that we follow. It's not that we don't see the appetite around the boardroom to place these investments. That's a high number that we've seen, but currently it doesn't give them the impact. And if it doesn't give them the economic impact, the long-term interest we see usually on the decreasing end. So there needs to be more push on that agenda, I believe. So then we understand technology is a driver. We understand that climate is a big driver. So now let's come to the third one. When we ask the CEOs about what they think is the main driver for them to change their business, they come back and say changes in the regulatory environment. So that's the third big driver of the change that we see across the boardroom. And the question we should really ask ourselves, is that a good thing, right? So yes, absolutely. Regulation there is a ton of regulation out there. It's aiming at really driving the economy, the functions, how a company actually works today. But is it a good thing, or is it actually, should it come back more to businesses actually driving that agenda and regulation support them and navigating their way through the complexities that they see right now? So what we did is then we came back and said, and this is what I said beforehand, so we understand that those three key drivers are really changing the businesses out there. But now we come back to are the businesses actually changing? And if so, are they changing at the pace that we want to see out there? So are we competitive? So we asked CEOs who of them or which of them would allocate larger than 10% of their company's resources. So those are financial resources, as well as, I would say, the share of the strategic agenda of the development of a company. And what we see there is that we are considerably lower than what we see in Asia Pacific, and we are also still lower than what we see in the United States. So that I draw the conclusion that we are not changing as fast as we see changes happening around the world in the boardroom. Even though the appetite is there, the speed is not quite where we would want the speed to be. So for obvious reasons, we asked them why that is the case. And if you look at this is, I believe, one of the more interesting ones is absolutely economy is a main driver. So you see that at the very top, macroeconomic volatility, but you also see that on the side of inflation. The second one is, let's go back to the geopolitical conflict, and this is before, all the things that have unfolded in the last couple of weeks and months. But then combine that to the cyber risk, I would say geopolitics stands very high on the agenda of the threats that CEOs see in regard to their businesses. And then the middle one, lower availability of skilled workers, actually is not the case in the United States, and we don't see that happening in Asia. So there is a big demand for skilled workers, which is currently still not filled, and I think we will have a good conversation about why that is the case and how, what the measures are we can take in closing the gap there. So last one, and you will see that I took the research of last year, because we did not ask that question this year, and I will leave it up to the room to decide whether the pattern has changed in the last 12 months. But when we asked CEOs last year about what they see as the lead barrier, they also reflected on regulation. So regulation seems to be a big driver and at the same time a big barrier for the change. So I think that is what we've been seeing across the bench, and we're seeing good trends happening right now in the European Union, but it's important for us to be reflective of the view that the CEOs have. So what? In summary, the CEOs see the need for change. So I think we're, again, pushing in an open door, but they aren't changing their businesses fast enough compared to what we see around the world. Secondly, the key drivers remain tech, climate, as well as regulation. And the main barriers are economic uncertainty, security or geopolitical uncertainty, a gap in the availability of skills, as well as, again, regulation as a key driver. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me open the floor to the panel discussion. I think the ones that I've picked up from Ruspe's presentation is that there's a lot of economic effects here in the play of the CEO's mind. You mentioned about economic uncertainties, macroeconomic volatility, shortage of skilled labor, and also the costs related to the climate transition. So I want to invite Daniel Gross to provide his takes on that. How does this, where does this come from, and how does this translate into the macroeconomic perspectives of the Union?
Thanks. I think these are very interesting results, but let me start with the part which I have most difficulties digesting, and that's the part on macroeconomic instability. Maybe for 2022, 2023, there was genuine macroeconomic instability with inflation going up and then down, energy prices going up and down, interest rates first being on hold and then suddenly increasing by an extraordinary amount, and then coming down slowly again. But overall, I would say last year was pretty calm on that front. Inflation kept coming down in central banks slowly. What I can relate much more to is the very first slide which you showed, which showed that in the EU the proportion of enterprises that feel that their business model will no longer be valid in 10 years is the highest. And that relates very much to research we have done where we found what we call the middle technology trap for Europe. What we find is that the European industry tends to be concentrated in what we call middle technology, automotive, machinery, and so on. Tends to be concentrated both in terms of revenues, employment, of course, and also in terms of R&D expenditure. And unfortunately, this is not only what is the case today, but it has been the case for the last 20 years. So the companies that today dominate R&D expenditure in Europe, the biggest three are almost exactly the same as 20 years ago, and 10 years ago, and almost every year. And they're all in the automotive industry, Volkswagen, Mercedes, Bosch, BMW, and so on. Whereas in the US, at the beginning, 2003, first time we have data, you had also two automotive companies, Ford and General Motors, plus Pfizer, right, and something non-automotive. In 2003, 20 years ago, a bit more. Today, you can imagine what the biggest R&D spenders are. They're totally different. So a transformation has taken place. But what surprised me was that in one slide you said, what are the business actually changing? And there I found the difference between the US and the EU rather small. What was it, 47 versus 43%? And the one way to explain that small difference with a big difference is perhaps very simple. A small part of the US economy started to invest in and be active in this new high-tech software, right? Wasn't called AI at the time, internet stuff. And it was a very small of the US economy. Just over 20 years, it has become so big that it now dominates actually macroeconomic development in the US. Whereas in the EU, none of this existed, and unfortunately none of this exists still today almost. And it is this inertia, I think, which is the biggest problem in Europe. So by now, our big companies perceive that they should change, but can they? Can you become a high-tech company if you are VW and your business making cars? Right? That is the question. The forays they have had into software were not exactly very successful. And very interesting, the most, let's say, high-tech ventures which the German and other automotive companies in Europe do, they all do them in the US. Right? When they invest in new things, right, to make either they make their automobiles more spicier or just finding new business niches, they're not doing it in Europe. And I think that should have given us pause for thought. What can be changed so that this happens more in Europe? Maybe the regulatory environment would be one part of it. Maybe restrictive labor laws, mainly the cost, maybe because the cost of failure is very high in Europe. But these are all the issues we should look at. Not so much that we play catch up with the US in the areas where they're presently strong, but so that we sow the seeds today for a stronger high-tech or different tech European industry for the future.
That's a great segue, I think, to Uti. So what should the EU do to see this change, as Daniel says, different tech or the high-tech transformation?
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to say to start with that we also run surveys among companies. Our results are rather similar. Of course, the questions are slightly different. On top of the list of what companies in our survey highlighted as the biggest constraint to their expansion was lack of demand, and in the current slow growth environment, that is normal. And the second one was labor shortages, lack of skilled labor. When I looked at your questions, I was a bit surprised to see technological disruption coming up so high, even higher than, for example, climate change. And I didn't see supply chain disruptions at all, which during and just after the pandemic were by far the biggest issue in the EU when we asked companies. Now they have also, our service, gone down, but looking at the geopolitical situation, maybe the supply chain disruptions, economic security, availability of critical raw materials could come up with another issue soon. I wanted to make one other comment, which is half policy and half methodology, because I understand that the CEOs that you interview are very much from the larger end of the company scale. In the EU, the decarbonization policies have to address the biggest companies which emit the most, but we have a very large small business sector. The small businesses in the EU account for half of private sector output and 2/3 of jobs, and their emissions are similar to their proportion of the labor force. So 2/3 of emissions come from small businesses. And there, if you ask them how they are going to become more productive, more competitive, how they are going to decarbonize, the challenges are often very different. We did a survey on digitalization and artificial intelligence among SMEs 3 years ago, and the smaller the company, the less likely it is to embrace the new technological revolution. A very large share of the smallest micro companies answered that things like having a website for the company is not part of their business model, and they don't see the case for it. So moving from there to the exploitation of artificial intelligence in increasing productivity and changing the business model, we are quite far. The Commission, and in particular the new Commission, which took office in December, has looked at the challenges, the service, the evidence. We see declining industrial output, declining productivity, declining employment. And last week there was a first big package called Clean Industrial Deal, which looked at the regulatory requirements. There was a lot of reduction in the reporting burden on decarbonization policies. Companies are expected to embrace policies against climate change, but how much they can be asked to submit reports on that. For the smaller companies, there has been a huge cut now. The last week's package would cut on the due diligence and corporate social responsibility reporting about 80% of the existing group of companies which under current law would need to report. To help companies decarbonize, there's going to be more financing, and of course we are moving towards a new EU financial framework, but there's going to be more money soon to help companies decarbonize. State aid rules will be reformed to reflect that need, but of course private capital is needed as well.
Uchi, do I hear it correctly that the burden for the climate transition will be easier for the SMEs than for the large companies? That's what we read.
It has always been the case. Small businesses have been excluded from most of the reporting obligations, but now there's going to be a further cut of another 80% of under the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, we are talking about 50,000 companies which had to report, and what will be left is about 10,000. And
but
there are,
the quick question is, because in Rusbe's presentation, the costs were higher than the revenues for most of the CEOs. So Rusbe, back to you. Which CEOs have you surveyed? Big companies, SMEs?
So I would say all of them, right? So I think this is a representative group of CEOs. I think it's, if you look at what the European Commission has done with the omnibus, I think it's going in the right direction. What we are hearing and seeing is that even large enterprises are overburdened with the regulatory and the reporting demands. One could say it's good for business for someone who's in the audit space and actually gives advice as well as implements these. But we would much rather spend time talk about the new business models that we want to see out there, how we can compete with the rest of the world. So I do think that it's good that we've taken 85% of the companies out of the scope of it. But I do also think there is a need to relook at the scope of actually the regulatory burden to understand how we can scope it in a way that it actually drives a benefit in regard to how companies position their products and services in the market. Because that's the only thing that's going to drive decisions in regard to what do I buy. Do I understand what my green footprint is in buying that product? If the reporting gives me that insight into how a company operates, I think that would be to point that out clearer, I think would be a good move.
Sure. Uti, if you don't have any further takes on the regulatory, does it create enough incentives for the SMEs? Then I'll bring in James and we can come back to this. James, USPE said that geopolitical concerns still come up high on the agenda, even though we saw on the graph it was quite low. I mean, but compared to the other, I think, parts of the world. Do you want to have your takes on that?
Well, the presentation I'm going to give in, I think, 5 minutes or so is very much what voters think, as opposed to CEOs and policymakers, the people in charge. In terms of geopolitical concerns, look, I run a company, actually a generative AI company, that's an SME. So actually the subject of the discussion here in terms of from a policy-making perspective. But for us, it's really real. We've got engineers who are Ukraine-based, right, who we have to communicate with on Slack. Structurally, we see across the space in terms of we conduct CEO polling pretty regularly. From our perspective, the geopolitical concerns have kind of come down over this year. Basically, they're about to explode. And I think you guys have seen that. I think the PwC survey next year will show geopolitical concerns right up pretty much at the top. Uti, is going to be very, very busy with that basket of concerns over the next year or so. And this has now been 10 years where we've had geopolitics, 10 to 15 years, where suddenly through a period of stability and growth, we see politics and the volatility and geopolitical disruption continually come to the top of the in tray for people who are running companies and running countries. So I see that only increasing, basically.
Forecast. And let's see what the audience thinks in the room. So please raise your hands, hear your questions, and I will send the mic to your way. There is one question down there, left side of the room, Antigona, just over the last row to the left. Yeah. Can we have the mic on, please?
The experience of PwC in this area, given your own business model, and also the views of others on the panel, whether a broad deregulation drive is really the answer to Europe's problems with productivity and growth, or whether that's the kind of word of the day, but we need to break it down much more into precisely which kinds of regulation at which level would really have an impact on productivity and growth.
Thank you so much, Heather. Other questions in the room?
Working? Yes. Hi.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alessio Mitra from the Commission. So I have a question regarding the survey of PwC, because I see that you're asking to a CEO whether expect the impact of their investment on green, on revenues, and on costs. But what if the investments on greens are different types of investments? Because if the investment that the European companies are doing are fundamentally and structurally different than the investments on green that the American companies, then the answer is just depending on which type of investments. Maybe in the EU, we are doing investments which are more costly because we are different regulatory environments or are maybe higher standards compared to the US. So I wonder whether we are really comparing apple with apples with that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I will close the Q&A here for a while now, but I will come back to you again. On the takes, shall we start from Uti, because both of them were very much policy related. So the deregulation, how much that affects the productivity growth, and then another one, which type of investments are we talking about in the EU?
On the regulatory requests that come to the Commission, you will not be surprised to hear that a lot of companies come to us to say that they would like to see less regulation. But I would like to pick up one particular area, which is a single market, which really is the core for EU's economy and competitiveness. And now that we may be going into a global trade war, we will have to invest very heavily in making sure that the single market functions well, that our companies keep their internal market, and there is no huge regulatory burden from moving to one national market to another market. We have harmonized a lot of product legislation, services, rules, but we still get a lot of reports from both citizens and companies on obstacles which either have existed for long or new national barriers which national governments are putting up. And this, I think, is an area where no CEO or very few would like to see more regulation. So the harmonized rules, having one rule for the whole EU and not 27 national rules. I think this is the key deregulatory request that we get.
Sure. Takes from the other speakers?
If I may, I think what we are seeing is that they don't really distinct between local and EU-wide regulations. Most of the companies are actually active in a lot of member states. So yes, absolutely, there is a point on that one. But they see this as a general model, so all of it kind of fits into one another, and they feel like the burden is extremely high. If you take a look at it, again, if you want to change a large-scale organization right now, it kind of eats up all of your resources, all of your time, and all of your focus. And every CEO across the board, in every boardroom that I interact with our clients, is looking at us and goes, every single thing that would keep me from changing my business model today would be on the negative side. So absolutely, I do believe that regulation in some cases might even be a point that they raise because they haven't been fast enough in actually changing their business models themselves. But I think it's still a valid point if you look at all the time and all the work and all the resource going into the compliance part of it versus changing their business models. Also, let's not underestimate that these companies are not competing with European companies or with German companies, or they're competing globally. And what we do see right now is deregulation happening in other places a lot faster. And I do think that we can read this in the numbers of how fast are they going to change compared to some of the other companies around the world. So, yeah.
Rusbet, just a quick follow-up question on the second question, and that was, did the survey have a breakdown? Which sectors are we talking about when it comes to the investments on the climate transition? Did you have a sectoral breakdown?
Yeah, I would have to get back to that.
No worries. Daniel?
I've been in Brussels for a long time, and deregulation has been on the agenda for a long time. So I would like to see your results going backwards, and my suspicion is that business has complained about regulation for a very long time. And actually, the EU has had various deregulatory agendas. And already the famous Lisbon strategy, right? More than 20 years ago, to make the EU the most competitive economy in the world, was based on structural reforms, right? And the OECD has indicators of structural reforms in product markets. And they show a continuous improvement over the last 20 years. So I must say I'm a bit baffled, right? I can understand there are some high-profile examples of perhaps very intrusive regulations in terms of reporting requirements recently, supply chain and due diligence and so on, right? But otherwise, what I see is actually that at least if we trust the official data and also the ease of doing business of the World Bank, there has been an improvement. There has also been improvement, at least for goods, in terms of the integration of national markets. So I have difficulty squaring that with those saying deregulation is really the obstacle. And I have some sympathy for one of your side remarks when you say maybe they blame regulation on themselves not doing enough.
First, but you want to?
No, thank you. I think that's a good point. But if you just take data just as an example, right? So the world is data-driven, and if you look at data as a currency exchange rate, currently, if your company is situated in the United States, you would monetize your access to data. So you would monetize your data, and the exchange rate would be 10x, and even more than that. So how do you want to operate a digital business where the value that you provide to customers is based on the data that you have access to? If someone else has an exchange rate of 10x, that's not a fair market condition, one could say. One could also argue, is that even a market, or are those two different markets? But most of these companies interact in the European Union, and they, you could argue whether they take advantage of it or not. But I do think that, we would have to look at every single piece of the regulation to understand. I think overall the term is being used a lot. But the moment that you dive into particular topics, you would find out that some of these things can be quite burdensome for companies.
Sure. James, do you have any takes to share with us on these questions, or ready for the second survey presentation?
I think they'll be hearing from me enough, so.
Sure. So let's go and have a look what voters think across Europe. I must say that James has been very busy running this poll even the last week, so this is a very fresh result that we are hearing for the first time here.
Thank you very much. And the focus now, I think, shifts away from policymakers and CEOs to the people that put them in place, which is the voters and everyday people. I'm from a company called Focal Data. We are an AI generative research firm. We are the UK's fastest growing research company and one of Europe's fastest growing ones. And this research was actually conducted on Friday. So my team had a fun weekend. All the discussion about deregulation. In terms of what this survey is about, this is really about 4 structural challenges from a public opinion perspective that voters we want to kind of garner their opinions about, and we'll go through the SINS and what's driving that. And I think it's going to have a lot of import for the discussion that will be occurring after this particular event around what policymakers, the challenges that they face. So for the purpose of this presentation, from a public opinion perspective, if you take a step back, for the purpose of this research, we've surveyed France and Germany, and we've used the UK as a control. Is to understand where voters are on security, on immigration, on the lack of growth that is occurring in those economies, and on social spending. And these all have a very sharp interaction. And the conclusion, I can save you the 10 minutes, is that voters want everything now in mutually exclusive ways that create massive problems for policymakers, which is not a new finding. But look, when it comes to security, obviously this is an extremely topical piece of research, and this is the primary piece of news that's going across the world. But I really wanted to cover, first of all, defense spending. And I think in the first instance, this looks like strong and good news that most of the public understand that there's going to have to be an increase in defense spending. But if you take a kind of closer look, over half of the public either think we'll have to maintain or reduce it. And in particular, France, we're going to return to France, is quite an outlier. I'm going to be releasing the numbers across Europe for these next week. But for me, I think, although this looks like good news about a new consensus for increasing defense spendings, actually when you look into the detail, even now, with all of the instability, we've got close to half either maintain or reduction from that perspective. Moving on, I think we also surveyed, and the findings for the rest of the European Union are also replicated by this, which is that voters are very clear that they want far more cooperation amongst European allies on foreign policy, where we've got between 40 and 50% of people. And these findings are also replicated, by the way, for European countries that are outside the European Union as well. But from our perspective as well, NATO membership remains a key cornerstone. We see very high levels of between 70 and 80%. This is not replicated across the whole of the European Union, as my findings next week will indicate, drawing on long, sharply held historic lines from that perspective. I think what's really interesting, though, is that the desire of the plurality, but not the majority, for increased defense spending does not flow over into public opinion attitudes about whether to maintain Ukraine funding. So for those governments that are looking to increase that, there is a public opinion challenge, which is that a lot of voters are quite skeptical about the funds that have gone there, or necessarily whether they should cut back on that now. And we've been researching this all year, so this wasn't the first time we've been running. We've been running this survey almost on a weekly basis now for the last 2 years. Moving on, immigration, and I'll try and keep this brief, but broadly, I've been polling for a decade and a half. I've run data campaigns and strategies across over 12 federal and national elections across the world. I have never seen public opinion across so many Western countries unilaterally skeptical about immigration, ever. I often hear, particularly in London, in New York, in Brussels, in DC, that this is a return to normal. It's not. These are levels of skepticism that I certainly have not seen in the recent past. In this particular survey, over 60 to 70% of voters across these jurisdictions think that immigration is too high. Between 5 and 7% think it's too low, which on a margin of error is almost close to zero. And I think it's really worth reflecting, but the detail also indicates this. And when we're thinking about what is driving voting patterns across the world, and particularly across the European Union and the West, here you can see across a number of different ranges of policy options, people are now of the opinion that on a net basis, there are more downsides than upsides as immigration policies stand. Obviously, I'm not a particularly neutral adjudicator on this particular subject, but I think my job is to articulate what the findings are from particular countries. Just to kind of handle, and I think this is the most important slide on the immigration section, we are now at peak salience for immigration. And I say peak, what I mean is the highest level. I'm actually not sure that the peak has continued. It continues to be the top issue across these 3 jurisdictions. It's actually higher in a number of other European jurisdictions that we're measuring. But crucially, this is now translating into a change in political support. So the share of all voters who think that a radical right party is best placed to handle immigration is now is chosen as the first option across all of these jurisdictions. So this is hardly described as the slide pack of fun, but now it's going to be some slides on no growth. There's been a lot of discussion here about deregulation, about growth, about the fact that when I graduated from university, the EU and US were similar-sized economies, the fact that they had similar numbers of prestigious and large companies, and the fact that that is completely different now. Unfortunately, it looks like the European electorates haven't really woken up to this, and I want to, and I'll be releasing the US polling for this because it is vastly different. We asked people whether what they were most proud about in their country, and I want to point out that in Britain it is 17%, in France it is 21%, in Germany slightly more proud of its industrial heritage, and you can say that for the number of names that were listed today were almost all German companies in the automotive sector. At 30%. I want to point out that this is very structural. This is extremely important. That in eras where policymakers and politicians drive pro-growth policies, they are often responding to voters who are more proud of the businesses that they operate in those jurisdictions. So there is an effective, quite a large public opinion problem. Now getting into the detail. From our perspective, we've analyzed pro-growth versus anti-growth beliefs. I know that from the last presentation, there'll be lots of questions on methodology and should questions have been framed in this particular way. But the point of this is to really get at a high level what is going on across European jurisdictions. And what we can see here is we paired statements that basically have tried to stereotype what would be a pro-growth versus less pro-growth characteristic. And what we can see here is that the German and British electorates, and actually many of the European electorates, are in a more pro-growth frame of mind. So for example, if we ask, are you excited about the increasing use of new technologies, or are you pessimistic? We can see actually in France is pessimistic. We can see in Germany quite striking optimism. When we ask, is economic growth likely to unlock more of humanity's potential, or it is simply not an important thing to make people happy, we can see that the UK and Germany strike out as more optimistic about the need for growth. France, again, taking a slightly different point of view. I think for me, what is very interesting is where the public are on innovation, because that will be a theme, I think, throughout the number of sessions that are done here. And we can see here that actually across the European Union, we'll be releasing, as I said, our wider stats. Voters have yet to understand the importance around innovation and progress and economic growth. This has created a loop, feedback loop into policymakers and to CEOs, and you can see here that there's the numbers here for the US would be completely different, a totally different mindset about where those economies need to go and where they are. And we don't really think of economic issues and cultural issues as one of the same, but public opinion polls often prove that. The last thing I want to do on no growth is the idea of zero sum. You're actually going to hear a lot about this in policy areas over the next couple of years. Zero-sum beliefs, there's a recent academic paper out from Harvard, and the zero-sum belief is basically the old Gore Vidal quote, which is, every time one of my friends does well, a little bit of me dies. That is effectively what a zero-sum belief is. What they have found is that believing in zero-sum beliefs is one of the key predictors behind left and right-wing populism. And what they have also found is that it is rooted, and what I mean by zero-sum here is we've defined it as people can only get rich at the expense of others. Further economic growth will not make people happy. We should focus on making do with less. And what they have found is that those beliefs are effort-suppressing beliefs that lower people's ability to support pro-growth policies. They've also found that the main driver of it is the lagged GDP per capita growth of your childhood. So you can see here that the actual economic performance is basically in lockstep with a loop around what people's attitudes are, which then leads them to be less supportive of pro-growth policies. Social spending. So I think if you look at the data on defense spending and you look at what is happening across the continent, there's clearly going to be a need for a restructure of how we fund our defense forces. I also think it's very striking that people don't just want the status quo on social spending, they actively want it to go up. So you can see here that the policymakers are in a massive Gordian knot, which is demand for higher defense spending, but they still want social spending. And by the way, when I've surveyed this, flexing social spending for each of those specific benefits, we get similar rises also in terms of increase. So I know we've got old age state pension in there, which is to do with the fact that Europe's demography is obviously getting older. But I think, again, we're seeing that the public are demanding fairly impossible things of policymakers. And some more cheery statistics for Monday morning about the percentage that will increase. When we then ask, how will these be funded? The public are not clear at all. And having recently showed you some immigration skeptic attitudes, apparently the second most popular way is to attract young workers from abroad, which is an interesting definition of immigration. So again, you can see here that across the piece, across social security itself, immigration, and no growth, you can see that across the piece there is a massive challenge coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. Quite a lot to discuss. Let me start from Uti, and I'm not going to take my picks. I think they're all relevant for the EU policy. So share with us your takes.
Very interesting insights. I only have sort of random comments here and there, but maybe let me start from the zero beliefs, which was one of your last slides. There you had questions of the type of can we do more with less? And it's difficult to interpret, and maybe you have insights on that, but could the climate change awareness be somehow behind the answers, where people say that maybe what we need is a different type of growth and not the traditional? You know, could that have influenced the answers on this side of the Atlantic? It's a question. On what people are proud of, I must say rather shocking. I looked at the bottom row, proud of my political system. If you get to 10% of people being proud of their political system, it looks almost like a good result. And I believe that for any government trying to regulate and take a country forward, it is hugely challenging if most of the voters think that the political system is nothing to be proud of. I mean, music, yes, politics, no. On immigration, integration, rise of far-right parties, I think this also, looking at the things from the European perspective, this of course is also a challenge if there is a feeling in the EU that people would like to see more closed societies because we are building an open society and free movement of labor inside the EU, which has been a tradition starting from the student exchange programs where between 2 and 3% of university students in any EU country are from another EU country, and about the same goes for labor force. Maybe the last comment on defense spending very much reflects the world we live in, but support to Ukraine, I start to see a worrying fatigue in that sphere when the war is still going on and the future is very unpredictable. But these were just a few first illusions. Very interesting survey, very interesting results.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm slightly going to get penalised here for not having a pad and writing down people's questions, but I'll try and address them in the order that you asked them. So your first question was on zero-sum thinking and how that interacts with climate change. So the public opinion on this is actually very clear, which is that climate change and support for decarbonisation was previously not on a zero-sum axis at all, but with rising costs, the trade-off between would you prefer to have higher bills now and decarbonisation now, or whether we should push it out, public opinion has moved quite substantially more towards the latter position. But I think it's interesting, though, that is across European countries and Western countries in general that have taken a tilt to the right, we haven't necessarily seen a massive fall-off in climate change salience. So, for example, at the recent German election, the Greens were, obviously were down the least amongst all the members of the previous coalition. Climate change was still a top 5 issue from that perspective in Germany. So I think it's interesting and quite complex. I think on your question on Ukraine, I'll take your last question first. The data is very clear. There's been a lot of fatigue. 2 years ago, the public were very, very strongly in favor of unqualified support. That's only going to grow. Again, I would say there's a big difference within the European Union, depending on geopolitical trends. But I think that fatigue will continue. It always does. If you measure public opinion across previous wars through the 50s and 60s and 70s, and you go through the archives, you see very similar trends. I think to take your question on immigration, which is a very challenging one, there's a couple of things. The poll did show the paradox, which is that people are very variegated as to their opinion on immigration, depending on who's coming and the numbers, and where, and when. It's all conditional. So the fact that the second most pro-growth policy was young people moving from abroad is literally immigration. But again, when you test people's highest concerns, it is immigration in the negative sense. And I think what governments need to respond to is this difference. But thank you.
Thanks, James. Daniel?
Yeah, just to take the last point, I think it's pretty clear that whether we like it or not, people want to have a two-class immigration policy. Sometimes was called the Canadian model, whereby you attract highly qualified young people, but keep out those who come to ask for asylum or because their home countries are in civil war and so on. And I think that's the unpleasant reality our policymakers face. So in that sense, it's not so much a contradiction, it's just they want very different things.
Yeah, it's a nuance. I mean, the slide that we took out for this presentation, because it was only 10 minutes, was we listed for every major country where we've had large migration from, how people comfortable they were. And the difference between the least and most popular country was 73 points. And we can circulate that slide after this presentation. But European capitals are going to have to get to grips, from my perspective, with this variegation.
I mean, intra-EU mobility has not been a problem really, except for the UK, right? On the continent, I have not heard in any campaigns or selection campaigns, perhaps you can confirm that for Germany as well, even Bulgarians, Romanians coming after some scandals in the past about welfare benefits. That's actually not the issue. So in that sense, the intra-European mobility is not being put into question. It's just that the people coming from outside, and they're coming, mainly they're much lower skilled, and they have more difficulties integrating.
Well, Daniel, just on that, British attitudes have actually come much closer to European attitudes. So the poll illustrates actually that Brits are much more comfortable with European migration now than they were 5 years ago.
A lot of paradox.
I'm not even going to comment on that at all.
No, but even for the UK, I think there have been a lot of studies that show that immigration usually are younger, they're healthier, and they contribute to the budget. So I sometimes wonder whether this is really the manipulation of the public opinion, because economic research is not something that supports that. But Rusba, anything that spoke to you that kind of lines up to the survey you've presented?
I think quite a lot, actually. So I think losing national pride in business I think is something that absolutely everyone around the boardroom is seeing today. That people, you mentioned a few of the clients that I talk to very regularly in the automotive sector. It's an issue. It's an issue that they need to start to work on. So I think public opinion in that case is actually the same as employee opinions that employees of those corporations have. Where they see not only national pride, but even the pride within a business go further down. And if you look at, and I was smiling at the number around the increase of new tech in Germany. I think that goes back to the latest move to get rid of fax machines in the German, kind of public organizations. They're not using the fax machine anymore, so I think everyone is really excited about that. At the same time, one could read this as the population taking more pride in all the technical developments that are happening outside of the country that we are users of versus something that we produce ourselves. So that I believe is really interesting. And then I do also believe that that the entire issue around migration, and I'm a migrant myself, or my parents have been migrants to Germany. If you look at it, I think what we are losing right now is actually in a time where the United States are really closing the door. We're not having a brand as a European Union that actually promotes people to come here. And this is a big issue because people on the street will not make a distinction between someone that comes from here or someone who comes from there. And it really makes it hard for us. And I believe that there is a big issue, and I agree with you. Maybe it's used in the wrong way. Maybe it's, I don't know, being put out in the media in the wrong way. But I do think that's probably the single biggest issue because it could be a real opportunity for us.
Sure, and let's see what the audience thinks, so please raise your hand. We have one question here, Antigona, on the fourth row. Fourth row, the lady.
It's working. It's a question and a comment, and especially to the colleague from PwC. First of all, I'm an entrepreneur, and we do digital advanced solutions, and we're strategic partners of Dassault Systèmes, totally independent. We actually take regulation as a huge driver for competitiveness, and we mainstreamed parameters, such as climate and environmental, to increase productivity. And that is the answer to do less with more. And this is what we see. We redesigned a plant with 54% productivity achieved. That turns into environmental productivity. This is a defense. And the other point that you made, I'm sorry, I'm taking you against it. You said large organizations are slow to change because they have a lot of structure. That's probably the reason why we should focus, and the automotive sector is an example, on smaller, more agile, and more really innovative companies in Europe.
Other questions? Here, the fourth row. Yeah, great.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan-Willem Scholten from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. It's interesting to hear that the voters want everything and they want it now, but we can't afford it, basically. And if you have the 4 things, defense spending and support for Ukraine, 1, 2, social spending, 3, investing in the green transition, and 4, basically fiscal responsibility, which of those 4 do you think we should maybe drop a little bit?
Great suggestion. Well, we'll discuss that. Other questions in the room? Okay, there's here.
Thank you. My question is to you, James. I was wondering if you also looked at where were these people that you were speaking with, where are they getting their information from? What is the opinions that they have? How is it being formed? Maybe it was not part of your study this time, but you might want to include that because that will help us start responding to some of these very strange dynamics and dichotomy about what they were answering. So where are they getting the information from? Thank you.
Other questions in the room? This probably will be the final call. We see here the lady and also the gentleman down there. Antigona, let's start from here.
Thank you. Tatiana Boryviter, Center of Excellence, Ukraine. James, I have a question to you in regards to the defense spending. We have seen that the defense spending in Western European states went down. It's going significantly up in Central and Eastern European states like the Baltics, like Romania, like Poland. Do you see that tearing Europe apart right now? Is that exacerbated by the rise of the right movement? And how do you see that change in the upcoming year with the geopolitical turbulence at the moment with the US happening?
Thank you. Question to the gentleman.
Thank you. Louis Meuleman. Louis Meuleman, Public Strategy for Sustainable Development. I have a question mainly for Uti, I think. I was missing in the discussion so far an important part of the equation. We only talk about the costs of burdens for businesses, for entrepreneurs. But if you lower the burden for entrepreneurs, that could lead to a lower ambition, a lower effectiveness of, for example, climate policies, and that will lead to higher costs for society as a whole. So what is the balance between the cost for business and the cost of inaction, leading to higher costs for society as a whole, and to taxpayers, of course? Thank you.
Sure. I think we can come back to the panel and start responding to the questions. Who wants to start? Maybe James, you go first.
Which question?
Let's start with the questions. Who are the voters? Because there was the question, who have you interviewed, how representative they are?
So the voters are representative of each country. We run 4,000 of these a year, and we test them in real life in elections. I think, though, there's a slight inference in your question, which is what are these people reading, which Ruspa, I think you picked up on, which is, I think, there's a tendency, I think, in Europe to see opinions you don't like and to characterize them as misinformation. We actually specialize in understanding misinformation, and it's one of the areas that we look at a lot. And I think it's really, really important that we don't create ontological boundaries for opinions that we just don't like, or don't understand, or don't approve of. The rise of the right, and particularly the rise of immigration salience, in many ways tracks actual numbers, like of people who have arrived, right? the issue, particularly in Germany, had a very low salience issue until the policy changed. And when people look at the correlation between news coverage and not, they need to look at the fundamentals. And I say that as someone with a more progressive view on these things. So I think we need to stop setting those kind of boundaries from that perspective. And I think there was then a very, very good question from over here about Ukraine and the right. And I want to flip your question. I actually think that the issue of Ukraine and defense spending will split the radical right. It is one of the key issues on which there is no consensus across different groups across the continent. And you're going to see this across the piece because it gets to the heart, because a lot of the appeal of the radical right is a more patriotic backing that's strong on defense, but strong on, how can it be strong on defense when we don't want to arm for the nearest war? And I actually think that that is an edge case where there's going to be a lot of tension within different movements. So I would actually flip your question and invert it.
Defense spending, Daniel.
Let me follow up, I think, on your excellent remarks. I mean, there's two issues, defense spending and support for Ukraine. Those who have looked at the numbers know that support for Ukraine is basically not material in the context of our own budgets. It's around 0.3% of EU GDP and might have to increase to 0.5. The increase in overall defense spending would be more material. That would be perhaps, nobody knows right now. But I totally agree with what you said, that if you want to be more patriotic, right, do you want to spend more on your defense? And in the past, the right traditionally find was, okay, more cannons, less butter. So I think that is something that will become apparent. I think for the time being, it's elite-driven. And I think for the time being, they get a pass on it. I don't think you have a revolt in parliaments or on the streets because a few fractions of percentage points will be going to Ukraine. If I'm allowed to, I would like to comment on one part on this, what you're proud of in your country, right? This is the technological and economic strength. And when we discuss here in Brussels about the need to be more innovative, we say we have only, 1/10 of the unicorns of the United States, unicorns being small companies that are worth $1 billion, right? And similar metrics. Then I'm reminded of an intervention by Chancellor Scholz in the recent debate. He said, oh, we have X, I don't know how many, billionaires in Germany. Isn't that terrible? Basically, right? And so I'm afraid that to some extent, what we are trying to do here at the European level, foster innovation and companies that can grow big and entrepreneurs that got very rich, it's not exactly in line with what the population thinks we should be proud of when we think about either the nation state in Europe. And I think that should give us pause for thought, right? Is this the way to proceed? Will we make Europe more popular if we can say we have created X or Y unicorns? I don't have a solution to that, but I see that as a big problem.
Sure, big problem. How do we solve it, Uti? And also the question from the audience, if we had to drop certain policy areas, what would it be for the European Union? Because the demands for the voters are just really impossible, right?
I'm glad you got this question.
The question is big, but maybe I first pick up from the unicorns point that Daniel made, because we do not have an entrepreneurial culture in the same way as the United States, and somehow the national pride or admiration for companies which grow very fast is not there in the same way, or the right to try and fail. And this also has led to the result that many good business ideas which are born in Europe, they go to the United States to get finance. And this is something that would be a good thing to change for the future of the EU. So make your future in the EU if you were born here, otherwise come and invest here. On the question of what happens to climate change it's a huge risk to the planet, and if companies find it too costly to take the necessary measures, what should happen? Here you have a bit the economics textbook case of the costs are borne with the company, but the benefits go to whole society, and you should also then put in some public money to compensate for the costs. And this is already very much what is happening with the new generation EU, the budget that the EU put together during the pandemic to borrow money and give it to member states to finance it. In the first place, climate actions, but also digitalization. Now, in the new clean industrial deal, there's going to be a bank for decarbonization to help, and it is fair to cover some of the costs of fighting climate change, where the companies otherwise would not find a business case in Europe, and in the worst case, indeed, might consider moving somewhere else. I wanted to make one last point on Ukraine, because there's a question of support to Ukraine, but there's also a question of rebuilding Ukraine, the reconstruction, which is ahead at some point. The Commission has made the commitment to integrate Ukraine and the other candidate countries to the single market as soon as possible, and we are already working very closely with the authorities, the candidate countries, including in particular the Ukrainian authorities, to harmonize legislation. This will also create business opportunities and investment opportunities for European companies. The reconstruction is going to be a massive effort, but it is also going to be an effort where European businesses may find a lot of opportunities. So it's not only a lose-lose, it can be a win-win. And of course, I hope that we are soon at the stage of reconstruction.
I hope so too, that it will scale up. But coming back to the question, if the EU had to prioritize, we have defense spending, social spending, and what else? And climate transition, costs to fund for the climate transition. Which one would the EU prioritize? I'm not going to say which one to drop, but which one to prioritize?
Yes, sorry, when you asked the question, I think I didn't get all the four, so I didn't answer, because maybe I would have missed the other one. But I think the first question, again, looking at things as an official of the European Commission, we have to see what makes most sense to do at a local level and what we have to do together. Defense spending, I think there's a strong case for doing more at the EU level, pooling resources and being more efficient. Climate, partly the same, because you don't fight climate change in a local municipality. You have to do more things together. Social spending is, in the first place, a competence of the member states. So I would start by looking at what can we do more efficiently and maybe reap efficiency gains and be able to finance more. So I'm not going to say we only need one or two, because we need all three.
Sure. And Daniel, maybe you have suggestions which one should be prioritized here when it comes to spending?
Well, I agree with the ordering by what level of government. Actually, on climate, I think we should regulate and spend less, and put even more the accent on pricing of carbon, which has actually been done. It's interesting that nobody has talked about the ETS, which is not taken as given, which works very well. As well as any big, complicated mechanism that can work. It's unique, I think, in the world. We now have a second ETS coming, which will price carbon elsewhere as well. And I think that's the way to go. As long as these things come in gradually, then we can avoid having to subsidize companies, which I find a very bad approach to subsidize energy-intensive companies in Europe, where our future is certainly not in these areas, where we should be happier for any energy-intensive company that leaves Europe and goes somewhere else. And on social spending, I think this is perhaps easy to say, but more difficult to implement. I have the impression that in many countries, the size of the spending is somehow in inverse relationship with its effectiveness. And there's a lot that can be done to improve that. I mean, you remember perhaps that Sweden had a ratio of government spending to GDP of 70%, and that was reduced to below 50 without any actually making people worse off. I think a similar case can be made for Italy, perhaps also for France. So a better organized social welfare system could yield enough savings to provide the room we need for defense.
Thank you so much, Ruspe. Any takes, and also maybe the final question there was how to strike the balance between the costs and societal costs and the business costs for the climate transition.
Yeah, so I want to say one thing before, and that was the question around where do people get their information from, and I think this is probably the one question for us to look at. I think this is the most important issue right now is regardless of what governments are doing and businesses are doing, people get information from other places. So controlling the narrative and making it easier for them to understand what impact some of the decisions have that both governments as well as businesses are making, I think this is going to be the most important point for us to take forward. And looking at where regulation is now going around social media, I think should get us all very concerned about how we want to make sure that people actually can make an informed decision versus being wrongly informed and making a decision that would then lead to a very different environment. Can you come again on the question, please?
How do we strike the balance between societal and business costs when it comes to the climate transition?
Yeah, so again, I truly believe that in the end, whoever buys or sits in a position to make a decision whether they want to be in business with a corporate, I think they will be the driver of the level of investment that corporates will put into it. There needs to be a business rationale behind it. And we do see this in many, many cases where companies are increasing their value of their brand as well as the revenue that they put out there and their level of profitability based on a different notion within the market. So people being able and or willing to procure services or products from green businesses. I think that's where the drive needs to come from. Again, I think striking a balance there is an easier one if you get it executed and communicated into the market so it drives a decision making versus just driving a regulatory demand. So I stay there, I would say.
On this note, I think we should conclude. Thank you so much for all the insights and for all your questions and engagements. Let's put our hands together. And yeah, I think we go this way. Oops. And I hope this discussion has set the stage for discussing all the things for the next 2 days, spark fresh ideas, find solutions, explore solutions for the pressing issues, and think ahead of Europe, because this is the mission of CEPS. And speaking of CEPS mission, this is my absolute pleasure to invite to this stage our research director, Andrea Renda, and our senior events and external relations manager, Andrea Pitnerova. Where are you, Andrea and Andrea? They're still ready, I think getting ready to come to the stage, but this is also a good time for us to give them a big, big applause, right?